The year 2000 was a good time to be a manufacturing worker in the European Union. Growth in Europe's manufacturing sector, as measured by manufacturing value added or MVA, moved at a brisk pace. From 2000 to 2008, MVA increased by a staggering 49%, and then it stopped. By 2022, 14 years later, Europe's MVA output was the same as it was in 2008. 2008 was, of course, marked by the great financial crisis, and it would mark a turning point for the Western economies. The turn away from reality, from nuts and bolts and steel and cars, to a greater focus on financialization, rent seeking, excessive regulations, and perhaps above all, over reliance on foreign imports. It could also be stated that the post 2008 Western world embarked on a war against cheap energy. If we examine electricity generation in the European Union, we find a similar departure from the historical trend. By 2008, electricity generation began to fall. By 2023, Europe's electricity generation had fallen back to pre-millennium levels. Some of this, of course, can be attributed to a greater focus on efficiency, but this efficiency factor is conflated with the degrowth and deindustrialization trends that Europe faced during this post-financial crisis period. A stark visual representation of this is the abrupt decoupling of electricity generation and GDP growth. From 1990 to 2008, electricity generation moved in lockstep with GDP growth, and then this too stopped. From 2008 to 2023, as if turning on a dime, this trend reversed. And Europe is not alone in this. The US too saw a reversal in the time-tested relationship between energy and GDP, although to a lesser degree. If we examine electricity generation for the US, the EU 27, and Germany, we can see that US electricity production flattened, with growth in electricity generation declining by around 85%. However, the EU and Germany went negative. Germany's decline in electricity generation post-2020 is particularly alarming, dropping 20% from 2018 to 2023. If we examine individual countries, we can get a better picture for how electricity generation has changed since 2008. Overall, we see that electricity generation in the European Union has declined by 5% relative to the 2006 to 2008 average. Germany, the economic engine of Europe and a net electricity exporter at that, saw a 12% decline in electricity generation. The other big EU economies, France and Italy, dropped by 9% and 12% respectively. The United Kingdom, not to be outdone by its former EU partners, managed to decrease electricity production by a staggering 22%. Lithuania, its nuclear generation stations having been forced into shutdown by the European Union in 2009, saw a 61% decrease in electricity. The US slightly increased its electricity generation by 1%. Some EU countries did manage to increase electricity production, namely Belgium, Poland, Sweden, and the Netherlands. The non-EU members, Iceland and Turkey, managed the highest increase in electricity at 53 and 76% respectively. The interconnectedness of the EU means that countries often import electricity from other EU members. However, the net decrease of 5% for the EU 27 bloc indicates that EU policy has generally moved away from prioritizing energy abundance on the old continent. Perhaps amidst the post-Ukrainian war energy crisis, Germany shutting down its last nuclear generation stations in 2023 provides the underscore for this claim. The dynamics of supply, demand, and pricing are of course operative. If we examine electricity prices across the globe, we find that EU countries pay a tremendous price for their diminishing supply of electricity. Electricity prices in Germany are almost 5 times higher than China and 2 times higher than the US. As a manufacturing economy, this makes it difficult for Germany to compete in the age of globalization. Ireland, Belgium, France, Italy, and the UK also pay a steep price. Relative to the United States, the European electricity prices have maintained the same multiple, with electricity prices being around 1.8 times higher in the European Union. However, the increase in magnitude of this price poses a challenge, especially for Germany. When compared with some of the other major European economies, Germany's electricity prices stand out, with German prices typically being 2.5 times higher than the US. Despite being one of the countries to increase its electricity generation, Belgium, the seat of European power and bureaucratic oversight, has experienced the highest increase in electricity prices, followed by the former EU member, the UK. Norway, the other non-EU member, blessed with its vast energy resources, of both the fossil and renewable variety, has experienced almost no increase in electricity prices. If we examine the major EU economies, along with the UK, the US, and Turkey, we find an unsurprising correlation between the change in electricity production and electricity prices. Steel production is a useful manufacturing indicator, and it is highly energy intensive. If we examine the change in steel production between 2005 and 2024, we can find that all of the EU countries, along with the US and Germany, have faced steep declines. The UK, not to be outdone, once again overperforms in this metric, with its steel production having decreased by an alarming 70% over this period. France's steel production fell by almost 50%, Spain and Italy's by a third, and Germany's by 16%. While India takes the top spot for percentage increase in steel production, China dominates the global market. Global steel production shifted dramatically to China between 2005 and 2024, with China's share of global steel production increasing from 31% in 2005 up to a staggering 53% in 2024. Next, we'll do an analysis of GDP, manufacturing value added, and electricity generation. We'll examine the change in growth rates pre and post the 2008 financial crisis, and examine the degrowth and deindustrialization trends in the European Union. We'll divide our timescale into two periods. Period 1 from 1995 to 2008, and Period 2 from 2009 to 2023. We'll perform a linear regression in order to calculate the rate of change, or M value, for the period. Then we'll divide the rate of change, M2 from Period 2, by the rate of change, M1 from Period 1, for these economic indicators in order to arrive at a relative growth ratio. Here, we show an example calculation for the EU27 and GDP growth in constant 2015 dollars. The GDP growth ratio, M2 over M1, for the EU was 0.73, representing a 27% decrease in GDP growth between the two periods. Performing this calculation for all countries provides this graph. In the EU, Malta and Ireland take the top spots for the GDP growth ratio, thanks to their very favorable tax policies. In addition to being a tax haven, Ireland has a strong biotech and manufacturing sector, high value-added products that aren't very energy intensive. Poland, an emerging manufacturing powerhouse, has managed to increase its GDP growth by a factor of 1.5. After the Soviet collapse and the fall of communism, Poland has indeed done well for itself. Romania, another post-communist nation, has also fared well. Denmark, thanks to its blockbuster pharmaceutical industry, especially the recent innovation of Ozempic from Novo Nordisk, has enabled continued economic growth for Denmark. If we examine the top corporations by market cap, we can find that Novo Nordisk sits at 26th place, one of only two EU-headquartered companies that makes it onto this list. Germany, the economic anchor, has maintained GDP growth of this period with a ratio of 1.06, while the EU27 bloc itself has a ratio of only 0.73. The UK fares worse than the EU27 bloc with a GDP growth ratio of only 0.65. French GDP growth has fallen by around 50%, Italy by around 80%, and Greece, wrecked by the financial crisis, has experienced negative growth. We'll perform the same operation for electricity generation. Here, the EU and Germany have gone negative. If we examine the big economies, we can see that the big anchor economies of the EU, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, have all gone into negative growth with respect to electricity generation. Netherlands and Poland have continued to add electricity generation capacity, although at a slower rate. Emerging manufacturing power centers like Turkey and India have increased their electricity generation significantly. For the rest of the group, we will ignore Sweden, Denmark, and Lithuania. Their negative growth or incredibly low growth over both periods complicates the use of the electricity growth ratio metric. And here is this metric for the rest of the countries. Norway is another European outlier with respect to electricity, having increased its electricity generation by a factor of 1.2 between the two periods. Estonia has experienced the greatest drop in electricity production as a consequence of its dramatic reduction in the use of oil shale as a primary fuel for electricity production. Finally, we examine manufacturing value added for these two periods and calculate an MVA growth ratio. Growth in MVA has fallen by around 50% for both the EU27 bloc as a whole and for Germany. The US, in contrast, has significantly increased growth in MVA, increasing by a factor of 1.4. If we examine all countries, we find that Ireland has by far the highest increase in MVA. This can be attributed to its high-value biotech and pharma sector. An additional point of note is that Ireland has very favorable corporate tax policies, incentivizing business activities and drawing in vast sums of foreign direct investment. Compared to the EU bloc and Germany, which saw MVA growth decrease by around 50%, the UK and Italy saw an even steeper decline, with MVA growth ratios of 0.32 and 0.18 respectively. The extent of French deindustrialization is such that the MVA growth ratio has gone negative, at negative 0.16. Norway, flush with its oil and gas money, saw the greatest decrease in MVA growth, with a ratio of negative 0.3. If we look at the big economies, we can find a correlation between electricity generation and the MVA growth ratios. Here, France and Spain are shown, but they are not included in the linear regression, as their MVA growth ratios are excessively low. The US, with its very high MVA growth ratio of 1.4, has also been excluded from the linear regression. For the rest of the countries, we find an R-squared value of 0.78, indicating that kneecapping your supply of electricity can have a negative impact on your manufacturing sector. Sadly, for Europe, energy is a big problem. If we examine the top oil and gas producers in the world, we can only find one European country, the non-EU member Norway, in the rankings. Further, the EU has demonized and avoided nuclear energy, a zero-carbon source of electricity, further exacerbating its high electricity and energy costs. France, however, is an exception, relying on nuclear power for around 70% of its electricity needs. However, despite this fact, electricity in France is still around 1.7 times higher than in America. The Netherlands has some of the lowest electricity prices of the big European economies, and it has also increased its electricity production over the past decades. With the EU's push for green and renewable energy, the geography of the Netherlands has allowed it to generate a lot of green energy, especially with its prime location for wind-generated energy. Solar and wind, however, can be intermittent, and opportunity for its use also varies greatly on geographic factors. Solar, for instance, is a challenge due to the fact that much of the EU lies in northern latitudes. Much of Europe is not exactly known for a lot of bright, sunshiny days. Much of this European sacrifice has been done in the name of reducing CO2 emissions, something they have been successful at doing. However, if we examine the reduction in CO2 emissions for the European Union in between 2000 and 2023, we can find that CO2 reduction in the EU has been drowned out by a tremendous increase in CO2 from developing countries like China and India. Turns out that shutting down your cleaner, more environmentally conscious manufacturing and industrial processes in favor of importing cheaper products from developing nations that predominantly burn coal for their electricity doesn't do a whole lot for reducing global CO2 emissions. Quite the contrary. However, what it has done is encourage European degrowth and deindustrialization. We can also see that the US has been quite successful at reducing its CO2 emissions while maintaining relatively low electricity prices. The US accomplished this primarily by switching from coal to natural gas for its electricity needs. The US Energy Information Administration states that 65% of the US's reduction in CO2 emissions is attributable to its switch to natural gas. The recent geopolitical troubles on the European continent have also not helped. Russia, the previous supplier of much of the natural gas consumed in Europe, especially in Germany, has now been disrupted. The removal of much of the Russian gas supply from much of the Western world has resulted in even higher natural gas prices. In the meantime, the U.S. has stepped in to supply Europe with its much more expensive natural gas, shipped across the vast ocean, further contributing to higher energy prices. We started this video by pointing out the decoupling between growth in electricity generation and GDP, a relationship that is really quite intuitive. Productive activities require energy. Economic growth requires energy. To increase economic growth, you need to increase the supply of energy. Factors like energy efficiency are important, but they can only take you so far. On a more abstract level, this decoupling illustrates a decoupling from economic reality. Abundant, cheap energy is essential for prosperity and economic growth. Ignore that at your own peril. As the Ayn Rand quote goes, you can avoid reality, but you cannot avoid the consequences of avoiding reality.